Go.
Yeah.
All right. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Hi, my name is Tim Neal, and I'm an associate professor of anthropology here at Deakin University, and formerly one of the conveners of the Science and Society Network that's bringing us this lovely seminar today, which is an initiative to support interdisciplinary research here at Deakin University. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet wherever we are on the lands of traditional owners, but here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge their ongoing custodianship here on their sovereign territory on the Lake Banks of the River. And thank you for their hospitality. For those of you who have not attended one of our seminars today, quick rundown of the structure of today's event, which is a seminar by AnushreeGupta, who's here. Thank you, someone, platform collective infrastructure in the southern city. In a moment, I'll introduce the speaker as well as our two discussants. Anushree is going to be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then we'll have some comments from our two discussants and then on to Q&A from people in the room, people who are listening online. So our seminar speaker is AnushreeGupta, a PhD candidate at the Department of Liberal Arts at the Indian Institute of Technology in Hyderabad, or IIHT. Anushree is our SSN visiting scholar. We're very grateful to have her here. Her doctoral research, as we'll be hearing today, employs multidisciplinary lenses to understand platformization and the tectonic digital shifts that have reshaped urban life in Global South since the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we have our two discussants. I think first we're going to hear from Juanita. This is enough notice. Juanita Tangasakseri is a research fellow at A2I2 here at Deakin University, or A squared I squared, I don't know which one it is, the AI Institute that we have here. And her research focuses on practical applications of artificial intelligence, bridging the gap between industry and academia, particularly in software engineering. And then our second discussant, Dr. David Porter-Giles, right? As a senior lecturer in anthropology here at Deakin. And he is amongst many other things, a political and economic anthropologist interested in urban ethnography, consumption of waste, homelessness, decentralized networks, and anarchist counterpublics. And I could say much more about that. I'll be chairing this discussion here in the room at Deakin Downtown, and I believe my colleague Karina Traits will be moderating the chat for those who are streaming in. And we're very keen to hear and answer your questions in due course, so you can either post your questions in the chat or in the room, raise your hand when the time comes. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand over to Anushree. What's the presentation?
Yeah, that's great.
Everyone, thanks for that lovely introduction. My name is Anushree. I'm a late stage PhD candidate at the Department of Liberal Arts in Hyderabad. I've been in the as a visiting researcher for about a month now. I'm really grateful for this work for helping me and sort of for hosting me here. For giving me this opportunity to present my work. Thank you, David and Vanita. I'm really looking forward to your comments and shortly help me develop my research further. So the title of my talk, as we said, it's to someone, Platform Collectives is crisis infrastructures, or that's crisis response infrastructures in the southern city. And what I'll be doing in my talk is that I'll sort of present some insights from my doctoral work. Which sort of broadly looks at the sometimes.
Just talk a little bit louder.
Yes, sorry. I'm stretching my ears to make them ask.
I'll make it
Apologies about
be a
that.
little bit louder.
Sorry, my microphone mute. But if anyone needs to move up closer.
No, that's okay. I'll just
Just struggling as
just struggling as well. So I'll just
Be a
be
little louder. So my doctoral work broadly looks at the entanglements between platformization and urbanization trajectories, and it situates them in the broader context of the southern city, and the kind of multiple ongoing crises that have happened in India, in the Indian context specifically, in the last few years. And what I reflect on in my work is the emergent forms of collective life, and especially in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the aim of my talk today is to draw out some of the conceptual ideas that I've developed in this research to understand, as I said, the tectonic digital shifts that have shaped life in urban India in this last few years. This project also came out of a need to sort of pay attention to the sort of ground realities of the pandemic and sort of try and understand how it was a very uneven experience even within India, despite sort of being understood as a shared experience throughout the world, in fact. But I'll describe in some detail what these uneven impacts were and how I sort of theorize these developments and why they might be significant for contemporary debates. Keeping in line also with the interdisciplinary tradition of these seminars, I touch upon some of the theoretical frameworks and sort of conceptual underpinnings that draw on different kinds of disciplines. While my training primarily has been in cultural and social anthropology and science and technology studies, I also engage with urban theory quite a bit in my work, and a feminist lens has sort of been an indispensable tool for doing research throughout sort of my academic journey, and I'll sort of discuss how perspectives from these diverse fields converge and the kind of questions that they enable me to ask and sort of the paths that they let me on. So I'll begin with a brief presentation overview. If, that's okay. That should help you structure the talk and sort of give you a little bit of a roadmap for how I'm going to go about it. So the big question, what my PhD is about, that's the first segment of the talk where I'll try and talk about the sort of main objects of analysis, research themes that describe my work. Then I'll sort of move into the empirical context and this the idea of the interconnected crises that really grounds my work, and the main idea of the ad hoc relief efforts, which I've sort of explored in my work. And after that, I'll sort of frame the main contribution, which is the theorization of platform collectives that this project hopes to do. The second segment of my talk, I'll talk about how I've sort of gone about this research to discuss the methodological and sort of choices and sort of reflecting on some of those trajectories. Then I'll sort of give a brief fieldwork overview and conceptual overview in terms of the literatures that I've drawn on. And finally, I'll discuss the papers, which I hope to sort of be the main focus of this talk. There are 4 papers sort of that one is published, one is ongoing, 2 are sort of in the pipeline. So I'll sort of talk about a little bit about all of them. And finally, I'll just briefly touch upon the things that I'm doing right now, how I sort of hope to continue this research and what next steps kind of looks like. I hope this will take 30 or 40 minutes. If I exceed my time, please let me know. But I'll try and keep it within time. So beginning with the research overview, there were right at the outset of my PhD, I think I was deeply interested in this idea of techno-entrepreneurialism, and that was a foundational sort of research interest for me. Because the phenomenon itself used to sort of, it seemed to hold a lot of sway in the professional and academic worlds that I had inhabited until then. So I have an engineering background, and right when I was finishing up my engineering, startup cultures and technological innovation was a big sort of buzzword in India, and it had started picking up steam so much as to become like a normative reality for a lot of young professionals who were graduating from engineering institutes in India. And from there, I sort of transitioned into the social sciences during my master's. And at that point of time, I was deeply interested in working at this intersection of technology and social good. And so for my PhD, I really wanted to explore that fully. But as luck would have it, I also began my PhD during a global pandemic. And there were nationwide lockdowns and travel restrictions and a bunch of other things, because of which I had to really rethink what my fieldwork would look like, what is it that I could study, and what were the sort of urgent questions that were coming up in that particular context. And so the pandemic and the state of urgency and emergency became a really defining context for the bulk of my PhD. I also began to realize in the first couple of semesters of my program that the central sort of categories, which is that of technology, entrepreneurship, and social good, they were unraveling, but they were also being rehashed in different ways. And so there was plenty of technological solutioning, for instance, that was going on in the country. Apps like Aarogya and a bunch of other contact tracing apps come to mind, for instance, which were launched by the Indian government and fairly uncritically, is what I would say. But that sort of kept my interest in these categories. But what I was also doing was trying to understand how the dynamics between them were being changed. And what I did eventually was to move them map them onto a very different spatial scale, which is that of the urban. So as I moved closer to the university I think during my second year or something, I moved to Hyderabad, which is one of the biggest metropolitan cities in India. It's in the south central region of the country, just to give you a little bit idea of the geography. And it was severely impacted by the pandemic as well. And I moved during the second wave, which was a period where caseloads were as high as 50,000 on an everyday basis in the city. And this combined with a lot of other sort of ongoing events in the country made it sort of really impossible for me to imagine in-person fieldwork in the way that I'd thought of originally, but the urban dimension sort of became really important as a focus in my project. And what I did become interested in was the use of digital technologies in the everyday as they were being used by urban residents. And that was the question that I was sort of finding myself interested in. And this was happening because primarily I noticed that the ideas of entrepreneurialism as a cultural reality, they were no longer externalized, they were internalized by a lot of the people that I was interacting with on an everyday basis, whether that was online and offline. And platforms played a huge role in that process. And so cumulatively, these ideas sort of led me to look at network volunteer efforts during the pandemic in Hyderabad. And these collective spaces were largely platform-based, but they were locally embedded as well as sort of had global reach. And as is well known now, they were super, super critical for getting any kind of help during the pandemic. And that's kind of what I'll talk about next. So before I do that, I just briefly summarize the kind of three key research themes for my project. The first sort of revolves around labor, which focuses on digital labor, gendered forms of work, and entrepreneurial cultures and entrepreneurialism. This sort of stems from an early interest in feminist essays approaches, in fact, to the study of technology and the intersections between labor and technology, and how ideas underpinning entrepreneurialism sort of overlap with the feminization of work, as well as sort of feminist theoretical perspectives on affective and emotional labor. Theorists like Ali Hochschild and Kathy Weeks and Sylvia Pedretti were people who I was reading at that point, and that sort of shaped this interest. Then the second theme is around Southern urbanism and collective life. And this largely derives from the work of urban theorists who frame Southern cities as geographies distinctly different from urban geographies in the global north, and not in a binary or oppositional sense, but in an epistemological sense that these geographies need to be examined in their own right. They describe the South as a relational geography, and the key idea that I sort of use in my sort of base my research on is the fact that the urban majority holds political, economic, spatial, and ecological vulnerability in these geographies, and that's kind of what defines characteristically what life in southern urban cities looks like. And some of the other descriptions that I found particularly useful is this idea of the geographies being incremental, tentatively assembled, provisional, fluid, and yet sort of grounded and collectively configured. And Abu Malik Simon's work on people infrastructures, and which points us to the thickness of social networks, is what I think has been a really important idea for me to shape this project. And so the larger aim, again, with this theme in this project has been to document the changing forms and modes of urban collective life because the digital shifts. And which sort of brings me to the third theme, which is that of socio-technical infrastructures. And that, again, emerges from an in-depth engagement with the infrastructure studies as part of training in SDS, which sort of conceives infrastructure as relational entities and as deeply political entities, and reading this alongside with more other sort of STA scholars who talk about socio-technical systems and assemblages. And that's kind of how this theme has shaped up. And so what I did take this to mean is that the category of infrastructures became particularly salient when we were thinking about the reasons for the crisis of the pandemic in India, the gaps in existing systems that exacerbated it, and sort of the approaches to cope with the crisis. And all of these ideas sort of point to the infrastructural question with respect to Indian cities. And so that sort of brings me to the empirical context of this work. Sorry for that wall of text. I'll try and pass through it for everyone. This was supposed to be an animated slide. It's not anymore. But yeah, so the idea with the slide is to just sort of briefly show a timeline of what the pandemic looked like in India. And it's not exhaustive in any way, but what I've tried to do is that I've tried to sort of divide it up into 4 sections. There were 3 waves of the pandemic in India, and there's one sort of section which talks about the preceding years in the pandemic, just very briefly. But what I want to flag maybe at the outset is that what is common across all of this, like all the different crises that were happening throughout each wave or throughout each section, is this like the experience of vulnerability and marginalization, and how it is navigated in the Indian urban context through community networks, through an ethic of care, and through sort of multiple ongoing negotiations that urban residents are constantly enrolled in. With material infrastructures, with the state, with each other. And so a lot of this sort of became apparent to me in my conversations with the people that I spoke to during fieldwork, who said that they were actively involved in mitigating multiple of these crises, almost all at the same time. So that's kind of where the idea of the interconnectedness of these crises sort of emerges for me. So I'll start at the beginning. The first section kind of talks about the first segment of this timeline is the period before the pandemic, where there were student protests and democratic struggles around government policies, specifically the CAA bill that was put forth by the government. Again, sort of out of scope, but what I flagged this here because a bunch of volunteers that I spoke to did come to the COVID volunteering space, as they called it, through that kind of a engagement with public action, with other kinds of activism and civil society work. And so that is also like simultaneous with a rise in techno-nationalism as a governing idea in India, where a bunch of different programs like the Digital India, the Atmanirbhar Bharat program, and so many of them. Along with that, there were also discussions around Aadhaar. So those were kind of the debates that I was really paying attention to, which sort of framed this idea of technology as political for me. And it was almost, I was looking at both of these things simultaneously, which really helped frame my understanding of how technology can or cannot be used for social good. So there's, on one hand, there were movements, and on the other hand, there were very specific kind of solutioning exercises that were hoping to solve very specific social problems. And so that was the context sort of in which I was imagining doing fieldwork and sort of reimagining the categories of my research. And then the notable point here on the timeline is the onset of the pandemic crisis, which happens in March 2020. The first sort of lockdown was on March 25th. And that date is etched in memory. That entire year was pretty much a series of lockdowns and then multiple unlock phases that happened in India. And following that, 2020, like that, but it was sort of also coinciding with the first wave of the crisis in India, which was when social distancing norms were put in place. A lot of supply chain reorganization happened during this time, which led to a huge migrant labor crisis from urban centers in India. And there are multiple written pieces and now popular culture documentations of that as well, which is extremely heart-wrenching to watch and to have witnessed as well. It also led to a lot of food shortages. There was immense panic throughout the country. You could see that in the online spaces. You could see that in media discourses, and just generally a lack of information around how to cope with the crisis. And this is what sort of frames the digital shift as well, which started happening which was sort of intensified, which had already started happening, but was intensified in this period when sort of work from home norms and all of these restrictions on mobility and access to public spaces were put in place. And so people sort of started using technologies a lot more during this period. This is then sort of followed with by the second wave, as I was saying earlier, which is when, ironically, there was no lockdown, and India was sort of reversing lockdown regulations. We were in that period, and again, there was a lot of critical discourse and debate around the fact as to why the worst happened after the lockdowns were removed. People said all kinds of things about people flouting regulations and things like that, but the most telling symptom of the severity of the crisis was that the health infrastructures were immensely overwhelmed in the country. A big chunk of the workforce was like categorized as essential, yes, but there was still shortage of medical resources and provision of care. And this was when I think this was the peak of the pandemic in India. After that, I think vaccination drives sort of started, and there was a milder Omicron virus third wave in India, which also arguably affected a lot of people. But the management of the crisis sort of shifted to individual and community level initiatives, largely speaking, at this point. What I also did notice and was observing parallelly was the rise of the gig economy in Indian cities around this point of time, which was when grocery services, platforms, ride-hailing platforms, and all of these things became immensely common and commonplace and normalized. Which brings me to the imperative of this project, which is to talk about the volunteer efforts that happened between the first wave and the second wave kind of period. That's the temporal sort of slot that I want to talk about from that timeline. And effectively, so my fieldwork sort of happened between 2020 to 2023. I tracked many such volunteer efforts and collective spaces that were functional in urban India. And I've obviously specifically focused on Hyderabad around this time after sort of zooming in, sort of having a broader idea of what was going on in the country, and then sort of zooming in the Hyderabad context. And pretty much all of them were using digital platforms in some capacity. And there were a diverse set of platforms that people were using, which sort of included social media platforms, aggregator platforms, people making spreadsheets, web portals, and so on and so forth. And some of the logos that you see on the slide sort of correspond to some of these platforms that I'm talking about. More common ones: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Twitter. Yes, but there are also more localized platforms like Trice and Blinkit and Swiggy, and some of these more urban logistics kind of focused platforms that also played a key role during this time. For this research, I particularly focus on three platforms, which is Trice, WhatsApp, and no-code apps. Two no-code apps, Glide and Notion. I'll discuss these in more detail when I talk about the writing. But what I'll do before I get to that is talk about the key kind of idea that we're hoping to develop in this project. So the image on the right, if you see, is a mimetic, sort of a meme or a mimetic image circulated in one of these volunteer groups. And this was shared with me with one of my interlocutors who found this to be a really meaningful description of what is it that the volunteer work looked like. So this is about collecting oxygen, like arranging oxygen cylinders for people who were requesting them online. So in sort of, it describes how volunteer networks were functioning, the specific things, the chain of events that went into arranging something as simple as an oxygen cylinder. And while sort of this image can be read as a cultural text, what it represents for me is this concept of, it's a socio-technical assemblage is how I read it, which consists of volunteers, digital technologies, and social network, and the specific object that was circulated. And so the key idea that we're sort of trying to develop is that of platform collectives, which we define as socio-technical assemblages that are constituted by a network of platform users, the technologies, and the digital platforms they network through, and the critical object system circulate through these networks in the suburban context. The three kind of characteristics for these collective spaces are that platforms function as infrastructures in some capacity. The collectives themselves are platform-like, and they're multi-scalar entities which connect locally as well as globally. So, in the interest of time, I'll move on to the next slide. So this that sort of concludes the first segment of my talk. Starting talking about the methodological overview and what the actual work looked like and how I sort of went about it. I'll start with the methods and methodological choices that I made. So, like I said, the first segment or the first part of doing this research was to just sort of shift gears and reorganize what my analytical categories were like, and asking some of these questions that I was asking of technology, entrepreneurship, and social good a little differently. And so what I was then interested in was this idea of how platformization and its logics intersected with entrepreneurialism. I was also paying attention to flexibility, affective and immaterial labor as part of tech-mediated social life worlds. And finally, I was looking at the collective dimensions of urban life and highlighting these collective efforts explicitly. That's kind of what I did to focus my research. Then secondly, I sort of leveraged multi-sited ethnography as a defining framework to construct my field. I was following very specific objects and artifacts and discourses through embedded research. And this largely revolved around platforms, entrepreneurial rhetorics that attempt to create these collective spaces in response to very specific issues that were created by the crisis, which is that of food or medical aid or information eventually. In this, so in like classical sort of ethnographic and anthropological ways, I sort of did interviews, surveys, and participant observation for this particular, that set of methods falls under this particular category. The next sort of methodological framework that I use is that of digital ethnography, which was again sort of really made fields accessible during the pandemic. And this mainly involves just sort of following social media discourses, being in different online spaces, engaging with them as much as I could, even though I did enter a lot of these spaces at a time when the peak had passed. But it still meant that through interviews, I could get a better sense of what is it that was going on, but also then have a sense of what the space itself was like by being there. And what I've also sort of done is embody a kind of user actor positionality in sort of using the range of different platforms that were also functional during this time. So that includes both social media platforms and aggregator platforms to, again, sort of understand how they function and what they afforded during the crisis. And then finally, I think more recently, I've sort of been using the framework of patchwork ethnography to kind of try and understand how I've sort of to sort of organize all of these different fragments of data that I was collecting and make sense of them. Sort of just put them together. I've also written some things on this, and I'm happy to share that link to the blog post as well. But one of the ideas that I want to flag from there is that there's this. So I've been thinking about windows, and that became like a really salient kind of object during the fieldwork, both online and offline. And I sort of talk about that as something that helped me traverse online worlds as well as through social media platforms, through app windows, and sort of give me a glimpse into the social life worlds of people that I was engaging with online. While also as an offline entity, they were really helpful if you can't get out of your house, if you're restricted by pandemic regulations. It was really helpful to just sort of have a window into other people's lives in the particular context that I was in. And they functioned as an antidote to isolation, which was also a really big problem during the pandemic. Arguably much smaller than everything else that was going on outside. So I'll move on to the specific cases now. So there are three instances that I draw on in my writing. This is the first one. I've sort of labeled them. The first one's called hyperlocal community, and it sort of corresponds to this community of home chefs who organized through a WhatsApp group, and they were delivering home cooked food, which was arguably more hygienic and safe to the patients who were quarantining. But this was again within the gated community and in and around the neighborhood, so it was a really hyperlocal effort in that sense. And they were using platforms like Swiggy, Dunzo, and the focus of my work, this app called Trice, which claims to be a connected, which claims to create a connected community. That's their whole pitch for the platform. But as you can see in the images, it gives you a sense of what the community space looked like, and that image on the right is what I was talking about when I was talking about windows, because that's an online window, it's an offline. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it makes sense. But yeah, so this is the second one. And again, I'm really, really sorry about all those text heavy images. I'll try and explain some of it at least. And we can talk more about it. I'm happy to talk more about it. But this basically corresponds to a volunteer network, which was a citywide network. And again, they were using WhatsApp to sort of coordinate between different sort of disconnected set of efforts. And they were, most of the times they were led by one single volunteer. And so this group just became a space for most of these volunteers to come together and share requests that they were getting from elsewhere, just stay connected, talk about things, and coordinate a lot of these emergency situations. And so some of these images are actually, yeah, they're just sort of emotionally heavy, and I should put a trigger warning, I suppose, at some point. But one of those images talks about how it shows how volunteers used to cope with the people that they couldn't save or couldn't help. It also really underscores and emphasizes the fact that there was a culture of volunteerism and that it was encouraged a lot during this particular time. It was actually really helpful. And social media platforms were very critical to that process. And I just want to flag that image on the top right. The no, it's totally fine. I can just briefly describe it. That image is basically describing the person who started this particular group. He's talking about how volunteer groups were very critical in a very specific period of time, and that for me meant asking this question of when is infrastructure, and that sort of really that entire description just really brings it out. So yeah, I'm sorry you can't read it very well, but it's not like that. And this is the last, the third instance, which corresponds to this community of technologists and aspiring entrepreneurs who worked remotely through a Slack team. Slack is a workplace, is for data technology, and they use Notion to verify and to sort of create a database of verified information to create a directory like no code app and a public archive on Instagram of COVID-related information and health advice feeds that they were coming across. And so most of the images on the screen just sort of correspond to that. That again, that image in the top right is the Glide app interface. The ones below are the Notion workspace and what that sort of looked like. And the ones on the right are sort of that's an onboarding email that was sent out to volunteers, and these are just calls for volunteers to add to the database. So yeah, those are the three empirical sort of pegs of my project. I've already talked about this before, so I'll just name these things. Essentially, these are the key kinds of literatures that my research is sort of grounded in. Science and technology studies, platform studies, infrastructure studies is the first section. Cultural and social anthropology and sociology of labor forms the second bucket, and the last is corresponding to urban theory, which looks at critical urban theory, backbone urbanism, southern urbanism, and digital and cultural geography. And at the heart of it is the idea of this commitment to feminist politics, introducing situated knowledges which offer a view from somewhere, as the paper said. Then I'll jump to the first paper that's sort of come out of this work. I think the main idea in this paper has been to look at the labor that's spent into creating and sustaining these platform collectives. And what we argue in this paper is that the affective engagements that urban residents are sort of enrolled in with platforms, while inhabiting urban landscapes co-produced by these platforms as well, correspond to the work of switching contemporary life in these urban landscapes. That's a very wordy way to just basically say that the people did the work. The key focus of this paper, again, like I said, was on the labor that was critical for sustaining platform collectives. And again, it's a constitutive piece to flesh out what platform collectives are. We do this using two sort of broad categories. One is this idea of coordination work, and which sort of looks at what kinds of coordination efforts were being made across each of these cases. And the other is this idea of hope labor, which sort of looks at how the work of volunteering sort of also sits very comfortably. I don't know. I'm still figuring out how, what's the relationship between the two, but the idea of volunteering as something that also adds value otherwise, which is, for instance, a lot of the volunteers who were involved in the third instance were also really, really interested in trying to understand how they can make more such socially oriented things and potentially also make a career out of it or like sort of monetize it in some ways. And so that's also thinking about sustaining some of these efforts in a little a little differently. So that's kind of the contradictions that I'm a bit trying to sort of bring out in this paper. The image again on the left that sort of describes the kind of affective labor again that we talk about in terms of the kind of emotional maneuvering that a lot of the volunteers had to do to stay focused on the things that they could do as part of the efforts and not on other kinds of contradictions and other debates that were also going on. Again, that's a contested space, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the discussion maybe. But the paper sort of does a critical feminist analysis of platform labor and what that looks like in some city. That's the main idea. Now, this is the main paper that I wanted to talk about, and I realized that I'm already really close to the time that I said I will wrap up. But yeah, so this is the paper that I've been working on more recently, which focuses on the infrastructural dimension and the infrastructural question that around network collectives and so the central idea, I think, for this paper was to sort of try and understand how the fact that platforms were scaffolding a lot of these networked effects, how that sort of animated the tension between the platform form and the infrastructural form, and what that looks like in the Southern City context. And so I've drawn on a bunch of different literatures here again, but the sort of analysis draws more heavily from affordance theory and specifically from Jenny Davis's work on the mechanisms and conditions of affordances. And I sort of use that to analyze how platforms enabled a crisis response and what is it that platforms afforded during the crisis. So for example, some of the images that I've included here correspond to Trice offering a personal assistant. And that was something that was used by a lot of the volunteers of the hyperlocal community to deliver the food. And this was often even like within the same gated community premises, the delivery personnel would go to one house, pick up the food and deliver it to another house and then exit the community. So that's also kind of what it looked like. Then similarly, the image on the left shows the effort itself, the low-code app itself, that interface sort of going viral because Priyanka Chopra was a famous celebrity, shared it on her Instagram, and that's how it sort of reached that user number curve in the first few hours, in the first 18 hours of the app going live. And finally, the third image on the right, that image on the right sort of shows how the WhatsApp group was basically operating, which is that people were putting up requests and there was a standardized format for this request. to be put up, which is not very clearly visible, but that was the idea. And then people would just sort of respond then with the contact and and send updates of whether or not the request was resolved. So that's the main idea behind just how a lot of these platforms are functioning. What I've done to analyze this is hopefully evident in this table, which is to sort of classify each of the platforms and their particular affordances and the conditions under which they were affording said things. So if I have like 2 minutes, I can talk about it in a little more detail. So Trice essentially offered logistical services to the volunteers, and the promise was that it was offering quick and safe delivery. There were it was fairly normal for platforms, in fact, to do temperature checks, which has again been written very critically about by a bunch of scholars. Ambika Tandon is one of them. Ambika Tandon and Ayushree's paper is something that talks about how this specifically happens in the gated community context. While Trice didn't do very stringent temperature checks, they did promise that this is what we're doing on the lines of the other platforms who were operational in the city, and what it also does is that it offered entrepreneurial opportunity to both the home chefs as well as to the gig workers. And eventually, what it does is that it creates a local marketplace of trustworthy products, which come from home-based businesses, which people you know are making. Sort of, that's the idea. So these are people who live in the same community or are homophilic in that sense. So most of these gated communities, again, for context, are populated by first-generation migrants, but elite migrants to cities who work in white-collar jobs, tech sector, and have a lot of disposable income. So that's the kind of context in which this is also operating. What it did for the particular effort is that the conditions under which this was also happening during the pandemic was that there was this whole community orientation, and that kind of was at the heart of the platform gaining popularity. And it's specifically catered to gated communities. So there's a large population that customer base sort of that they have, and it's a rhetoric that worked with that particular customer base. Then secondly, I think it did require some amount of familiarity with sort of operating apps and just digital literacy, I guess. But there was also a community manager that was provided, that was sort of a volunteer, and just they provided and offered to help home chefs who wanted to start using the app. And that's, in my context, in the community that I was looking at more closely, that's how most of the volunteers started using Trice to make the deliveries. Because the community manager was very active and very enthusiastic in sort of promoting the app. And finally, I think there was also a lot of discourse around local businesses supporting just Indian businesses around the time in India, during the pandemic. And this was, again, because of social distancing norms, but also the kind of political climate that we were looking at around that time. And so in the paper, what I sort of land at is that this produces a market-oriented collectivity for the particular effort that I was looking at. For WhatsApp, I think it was the fact that it offered instant messaging as a service, and that you could make groups and community spaces very, very easily and could communicate with them instantly. And the fact that you could share all kinds of media, like images, contact, location, audio notes, videos, and so a bunch of different things. And those capabilities, I think, of the platform is what I want to highlight in terms of how they afford, how WhatsApp affords collective spaces like these. And so what happened within the group is that it helped create this online space, which was fairly normal in India otherwise as well, even before the pandemic. But then that space was sort of repurposed. And there are, again, other pieces of writing also which sort of confirm this, that there were friend groups and sort of community RWA, like residential welfare association groups that were sort of repurposed to help with the COVID volunteering effort. Again, it sort of requires very little skill in terms of familiarity and just sort of being able to operate it. And there were other network effects that sort of facilitated volunteers being onboarded onto the app and being part of the group. And the fact that it was already a given thing in urban India. But for this particular effort, what I then sort of conclude is that it creates a more civic-oriented sort of sense of collectivity. People who are more concerned with social issues and politicizing them and just sort of engaging with some of those dimensions. Wasn't probably happening so much in the group, but yeah, a lot of the volunteers were otherwise actively sort of talking about some of these things. And finally, the no-code set of tools, what that afforded, again, was the ability to sort of work asynchronously, to sort of be quickly deployed as a tool, be produced. Like the idea behind no-code apps, again, is the fact that you don't need sophisticated coding skills, like programming skills or training in engineering to be able to make some of these apps. And so eventually what happened was that through this asynchronous kind of space, like collaborative space that they created, they were able to verify a lot of the information that was circulating online and sort of put it in one place and make it more easily accessible to a wider audience. And again, the conditions for this particular app was that it fit the bill in terms of being a creative problem-solving tool. It required very little technical skill, yes, but it did require this sense of creativity and imagining some of these solutions and identifying the problem statements, sort of mapping to it, and also then organizing the effort. And it's sort of validated by these wider technological discourses, which were again still very, very active and still very, very prominent in responding to the crisis and sort of solving social problems that were emerging around that time. And so for this particular effort, I say that it's a more entrepreneurial oriented collectivity, which focuses on user metrics, delivering a product, and sort of responding to user demands and things like that. And so, yeah, so for the discussion in this particular paper, and I could really use some feedback on this. I think there are 4 key points that I sort of flagged, and that's one too many for sure, because it makes for a very long read and it becomes a bit confusing. But I still think they're all really important to sort of think about what the infrastructural dimension looks like. So the first, I think, is this idea of infrastructural ambiguity, and this came out of conversation with Tim, where I was telling him that I'm really struggling to sort of map whether it's the collectives or the platforms that are infrastructures. And there's also a lot of work on this idea of Southern Urban Theory talks about how collective spaces are infrastructural in that particular context, but it's another thing to then talk about how the idea of infrastructure sort of changes because of the specific kinds of practices and like place-based things that people were doing. And so I think that sort of corresponds to that, to just sort of try and understand what exactly is infrastructure here. Then the second sort of peg here is to think about, can platforms actually be infrastructural? So there is, of course, the whole like underlying dynamics of profit accumulation and all of those market-based tendencies that platforms will prioritize as firms. But again, like maybe my hope is that I think through the paper, we can use affordance theory to sort of really think about this and connect that to the idea of collectivity and what that might mean in specific context. And the third idea is to look at the infrastructural imagination and how that can be sort of expanded and through like paying attention to affect and materiality. So again, sort of coming back to affordance theory and thinking of that as a scalar concept. What collective spaces as infrastructural entities also sort of indicate is that they're fragile and they need a lot of affective and immaterial labor to be sustained, which is also something that I've talked about in the previous paper. And then this sort of expands our idea of what counts as infrastructures really. And finally, I think the idea behind this attention to collectivity is to sort of connect it to public interest and to sort of think about what kinds of collectivities can lead to public action and can platforms actually enact public interest. So yeah, And now I will just sort of rush through some of these things because these are also partly because they're work in progress and these are things that are just ideas at this point. But one of the dominant framings is that of crisis. And I've sort of looked at literature that looks at polycrisis as a concept and how that sort of connects to the idea of compound urban crises, which definitionally, as Westman on paper sort of talks about that, is that they're unbounded in time, with impacts also cutting across spatial and sectoral, and thus sort of being non-linear and unpredictable. I thought that this was a relevant sort of way to think about how a lot of the interconnected issues during the pandemic were being sort of mitigated by platform-based collectives. And so for each of those, I've tried to sort of map what each community, what each collective space was sort of responding to. So that's the social reproduction crisis, which is sort of in response to that, mutual aid and community-based efforts come up. Healthcare systems inadequacies are then sort of supplemented by on-ground logistical support that's provided by volunteer groups who arrange things like oxygen cylinders, medicines, hospital beds, and things like that. And finally, the information disorders that sort of also characterize this particular period of time were then responded. In response to that, these asynchronous sort of groups emerged to collate, verify, and then communicate verified information. And so, yeah, so that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And there are also parallels with suburban theory and the infrastructural question, which I'm hoping to sort of, it'll all come together. And then, yeah, the last sort of piece of writing that I'm hoping to do is around methods. And there's this idea of movements in digital spaces that I'm very keen on exploring, but again, it's a sort of an emergent idea again at the moment, where I'm trying to think of algorithmic handling and virtual loitering as two modes in which movement in physical spaces can be understood as a method to produce new knowledge that is relevant, that is grounded, and sort of speaks to specific contextual communities. And again, patchwork ethnography sort of plays a role in just framing that field and trying to understand how the diminishing separation between the field and the home, both as context and meaningfully, substantively contributes to this kind of a methodological approach. So that sort of concludes this second big segment of my talk. And this is stuff that I'm doing right now. I'm writing papers. I'm also working towards my thesis. And some of the field-based collaborations that I'm involved in on the other hand is that I work really closely with the Hyderabad-based field workers union, sort of helping them figure out their everyday functioning and aid with advocacy efforts and things like that. And other than that, in the academic space, I'm also involved in the Labor Tech Research Network's India chapter, and we're hoping to build a collective space for people who work on platform research in India and on the Indian context, and sort of support unionization efforts there. There are a lot of questions that I have, and there are a lot of dimensions that I don't touch upon in this work, and there are a lot of directions that this will go in, but the biggest challenge in a PhD, as I've been told, is to narrow down and talk about one thing. But nevertheless, it's helpful to just list down some of these things as ideas for future research or things that I'm interested in, and things that I've parked aside for the moment. But a big one is to look at the public health infrastructures in India and how digital technologies have sort of shaped them in the wake of the pandemic. There are also questions around value that come up when we think about the intersection between volunteerism and entrepreneurism. Then there are methodological implications also on the process of knowledge production in academia. And the Indian case has been very interesting. I've had a lot of conversations with PhD scholars and other early career researchers in India who've struggled to have had very similar struggles, in fact, during the pandemic and sort of reframing a lot of their questions. And that's, again, not just limited to India. I think it's been a universal thing in that sense. But that's another one. And then finally, I think there's also what I flagged towards in the timeline slide. I think the idea of the platform economy and how it's evolved in urban India. That's been a recurrent kind of thing that I've been trying to pay attention to, both through academic work and field-based collaborations. And yeah, I think that seems like one of the more dominant trajectories that my work seems to be headed in. Because I'm also working with organizing and just trying to think about what feminist approaches to that would look like. And what kind of scholar activist sort of work could be done at that particular intersection in the Southern city context. And so yeah, so that's sort of what it looks like for the next steps. I hope those are some really just yep, that's it.
Well, there's a lot of work.
I hope I was on time. Yeah.
It's your time, so as well. All right. So as advertised, we have two discussants. We're going to be giving some brief comments and questions for Anushree, and then we'll have some Q&A discussion by the group. So maybe you go first.
I go first?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your talk, Gupta. It's really, really informative and very long talk. Yeah, so it's very interesting, like, to see, because we all know that COVID-19, the pandemic, affect our life. It's like introduced a lot of like digital infrastructures during the time. However, we don't have like a concrete example, so we can see it from here. And like it's just very interesting to see how the platform enables like crisis to respond to like the volunteer team as well, to use that platform as a tool to connect during the like lockdown time that we cannot like see each other. So another interesting point that I like is like the use case that you point out, like the three use case, it has a different characteristic of the platform and different and then benefit, like the different benefit to the society as well. Like for example, the food delivery platform or like the WhatsApp platform that is kind of like the communication point. And then yeah, the platform. So like at first when I entered this presentation, I thought about like the platform collective. What is the difference of platform collective to the digital network? Yeah. So and this talk kind of answer that. So I guess it's a like platform collective is part of the digital networks, I guess. Is that correct?
Yeah, somewhat. I think I've also tried to figure that out. But yeah, I think the idea is that there's supposed to be like network spaces, and I guess it's one step more like clarifying what particular kind of digital networks they are. And yeah, again, like the context is important. That's
Okay. So yeah, because like at first I thought like what is the difference? What is the different point? But I guess it's because like it's the point that it's gather all the volunteers, all the people who have like a volunteer mind to be together as a collective platform. So yeah, but then I think so this study is study about the past, mainly on like the pandemics, which is kind of already end. So currently I feel like the findings from this paper or like this study, like if it could be informed to a platform design or like a policy intervention somehow, like to better support the crisis in the future or like the crisis, the infrastructure, digital infrastructure for the crisis, let's say, that would be like that. Or like how is the like these findings gonna be able to sustain in the futures of like beyond the immediate crisis as well. Yeah. That's all my. Do you have any like plan for the futures on that as well?
So the writing that I'm trying to do around compound crisis and some of that, impact crisis, some of those things, I think that would inform, yeah, like I've tried to think about the design dimension quite a bit actually, because that's also where it organically sort of seems to be heading in as well. Because here are a few things that we learn, and here is how you can make platforms better. That's kind of what the approach seems to be. But what is like I said towards the end, I think some of the field-based things that I'm trying to do, they also like that's kind of I think where I also imagine a lot of interventional things happening, because it's also not just designing platforms better, but it's also engaging with the contemporary sort of realities of what the platforms that have existed in the past and what. And that's fairly contentious as well. So there's some there are things that are happening there that I've contributed. Yeah.
Maybe you can enhance like the policy of the different data platform. There's something to enhance. Like this kind of work.
It's a good idea.
I'll try to be quick because I know we break at 3:30, right?
Yes.
I'll try and abbreviate some of this. So as a discussant, your job is sort of it's the most open-ended of the jobs. It's sort of a choose your own adventure. And so every time I sit down to be discussing, I try and think of a new framework that's appropriate to the paper. Like sometimes I've written people a love letter to the text, and sometimes I've written a kind of constructive critique thing. But I thought what I appreciated that you and your co-authors are doing is thinking about what can the platform do. And so I wanted to write a response thinking about what can your paper do, or what can we do with your paper. And I guess by extension, what can we do with platform collectives as an idea? Or like, another way of asking it is like, what are the affordances of your paper? And I didn't see all the names, so I've read 2 of the 4 papers. I didn't see all the names of the authors on the one.
It's an art book. It's not text.
Don't write it.
It's mainly.
Well, first of all, thanks. It was a lot of fun to read, and I'm always grateful for the chance to think with people who are sort of pushing the envelope of how we think about a phenomenon, which I think you're doing, which is really helpful. And especially the idea of a platform collective as a kind of collaborative social infrastructure, maybe even one with like democratic affordances, is a really refreshing thought, because so much of platform studies and so much of the critical work on digital platforms highlights their role as sort of a functionary for power, like a functionary for surveillance capitalism, or even techno-feudalism. So it's really helpful to sort of indulge in some hopeful speculation about what they could do. So thank you for that. And what kind of community-based work they can do as assemblages. And I noticed you said assemblage rather than apparatus. Deleuzean assemblage theory is always more open-ended than the kind of like top-down way that people sometimes think about apparatuses. That I think is actually relevant. So I appreciate that. With all the kind of optimism that I'm gesturing towards, I also say this is someone who's just deactivated his Facebook and Instagram accounts because of the surveillance. I should be traveling to the US tomorrow, but visas are not available. And one of the reasons I deactivated them was because of the surveillance going through the visa process. So, there are both of those elements to them. I just wanted to insert a very small anecdote about the work that I've done with grassroots mutual aid groups. And when I put together my first Facebook page, back when it was called a page, it's about 18 years ago, and I was working with a mutual aid group for not bonds who would have hated to have a Facebook page. They all refused to. It was all sort of too dangerous, smacked too much of being part of these big, powerful institutions, and 18 years later, every criminal ops group I know has a Facebook page, and it's the most reliable way of getting in touch with them. So there's an interesting question there of the kind of the politics of what these platforms enable and what they make us into. So that as I was thinking about that and sort of reading through, especially the last of the papers that you mentioned, I kept thinking of Audre Lorde's question, right? The old question: can the master's tools dismantle the master's house? Right? Can big techno-capitalist platforms be used for liberatory ends, or are we just buying in? People always trot that line out in this kind of triumphant, dismissive way. And I don't think Lorde herself was as dogmatic or as dismissive as people quote her. So she was positing a kind of multidimensional theory of change. And she's posing a version of the problem that resistance has always posed, which is how to negotiate and transform the structures of dominance that we live inside. So what forms of life and organisation might we just identify as the master's tools, or Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls them reforms, structures and strategies that just reinforce the power differentials, and what forms of life and organisation might represent an exploit, in the kind of digital jargon, like a hack that renegotiates or redistributes power somehow. So your papers, and especially that last one, seem to contain a whole lot of possibilities. And I appreciate that none of those possibilities are closed. You've sort of left them open for us, which is really helpful. I also appreciate you referencing the Italian autonomists. So every era of capitalism involves people availing themselves of the form of capital that they live under in order to invent resistance of some sort. And the autonomists are the ones who give us that formula most appealing. They say resistance is primary with respect to power. And so the industrial proletariat created these large hierarchical Fordist unions, and then the post-Fordist structure of capital gives us a much more decentralized post-Fordist structure of resistance. So I appreciate that you are gesturing towards that constant dialectic there between how people, the forms of capital we live under and the forms of resistance and organisation that we adopt. And I don't think anyone's really given us a clear statement of, because we seem to be in a new moment, which is a sort of like late post-Fordism, right? All of the things that people have said about the post-Fordist mode of capital accumulation, just-in-time production, decentralisation, entrepreneurialism, all of those things remain true, but we're clearly in a moment where, post-global financial crisis, post-COVID, a kind of platform-centric moment where we need new theories of change about how we operate under and avail ourselves of digital structures of dominance. And that your paper seems to do that, or at least gesture towards that in really helpful ways. So I just I thought I'd riff on three of those. And these are all possibilities that seem like they're contained within the paper that raise questions but don't answer them, because they're questions to grow on as we watch and see how these things unfold. The first one is the question of capitalisation. Because we're talking about proprietary structures that make money for people. And you've raised that question. To know what a platform collective can do and what sorts of change it partakes of requires us to answer the perennial questions about the nature of platform that are in the process of being worked out, about the nature of platform capitalism itself. So to put it bluntly, how will platform capitalism make use of its users, and what exploits can they in turn make under those conditions? Another way of thinking about it is to what larger forms of dominance does the resistance of users find itself being imposed? That's an infinite number of questions, really. One thing Nick Cernicek, who coined the phrase platform capitalism, asked in 2016 was, is platform capitalism likely to be monopolistic or competitive? And that was 2016. I think in 2025 we can say, definitely looks to be monopolistic. So in that sense, if people are all using the platforms for their own ends, how does that relate to a larger monopolistic or even techno-feudalist arrangement? And some of the other kind of classic Marxist questions to ask are what latent surpluses are available to be turned into modes of capital accumulation, like what latent energies, what labours are available, and what are the trade-offs in terms of privacy and surveillance, and the kind of algorithmic socialities that people are buying into, while at the same time generating these potentially resistant networks of mutual aid. Another of the big open questions that I appreciated about these two pieces was about the kind of politics of infrastructure, of course, which I think is always a question of for whom does infrastructure work? And this is that apparatus versus assemblage question. It's an apparatus when it works for power. It's an assemblage when it has a more sort of open-ended ontology. And in the interest of time, I'll just leave that there. And then the last big question was about the cultural politics that come from within these platform collectives themselves. So you've given us some really interesting comparisons between potentially quite different, ideologically, in terms of ideological and identitarian constitution. You've given us some really interesting contrasts. So there's always a kind of, and I'm thinking of Jeffrey Juris, he distinguishes between the cultural logic of networking, which is the kind of, the mechanisms by which people associate, and the cultural politics of networking, which is the goals that they enable, and the kind of identities or the ideologies that like the projects that they enact by doing so. So there are always really interesting questions of what are the projects that people are enabling there. There's an interesting maybe counterexample in the United States, which is the social network Nextdoor. I'm not sure if they have Nextdoor in Hyderabad as well. It's basically a social media platform which requires you to have an address, and so neighbours use it to build social capital in their neighbourhoods, and they also use it to target and exclude people who don't have an address, like homeless folks. Right, so there's always a kind of a set of political projects that are channeled through any given platform. That's as much time as I think I would take up. But yeah, so I have those three big questions. What a platform collective can do.
This is super helpful, actually. Not everyone had anything immediately to say in response. Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking, that's a very generous reading of the paper, and I'm very, very thankful for all your comments, actually. But super helpful to see all the different kinds of possibilities that are sort of working. And I'm like really glad to hear that the open-endedness is not a problem, but it's actually like a good thing. The fact that it can go into multiple directions and that there is that kind of potential in the paper, and that's super helpful. I do think, like, to your point about the difference, I think, between apparatus and assemblage, I think that's something that I sort of got onto, because I do think that, at least with this particular paper, the infrastructural question can be to some extent clarified by making use of a little more constructive use of assemblage theory and just trying to sort of think about what it is not doing and what it is doing and like sort of who it's work. I do think the who dimension still remains underexplored, and I do want to pay a little more attention to that. But I'm also really glad that you brought up the Arjigard kind of discussion to it, because I think I've personally struggled with it quite a lot, to just sort of think about technologies as tools for resistance. And that's also sort of comes up a lot in my work with the worker unions. And because a lot of what we are doing there in that space is to also resist the very same kind of platforms using even bigger sort of monopolistic, like really, really extractive kinds of platforms to then say that no, this is wrong. And in some ways, like that's kind of what it becomes about. And I think it's an ongoing thing for me as well. I don't think I've resolved it in any way, but it does help to hear that there are threads to sort of track there. And to also the idea around, I think the Italian autonomous is like that body of work. It was super, super helpful for me to find that literature when I did, because it also really helped with the paper, the first paper that I was talking about around labor. Because like I think one of the things that can also sort of emerge from this project, and I'm curious as to whether or not that is a possibility, is to expand this idea of collectives and think about what in their relationship with existing forms of collectives. So unionization, for instance, has been thought of as one of the most sort of effective ways in which one can register any kind of like collective effort, especially with respect to like labor politics, and like if you're in a left politics kind of space anywhere. I think it comes up on the horizon at some point or the other, and I think I've been really invested in trying to understand how that's different, or what is it. I mean, and the dynamics of unionization have also really, really changed over the years, and especially when we think about platform work and digital work and tech mediated work. I think there are a whole new set of challenges that one needs to navigate. So that also really changes how we think about collectivity and collectives and collective action. And I think that's something that I've wanted to reflect on with respect to this as well, because it almost seems disingenuous to then think about other forms of collectives in relation to this ideal type. And I'm not quite sure if that is the case. And I think that's kind of also what I've been trying to do. And I'm really glad that that sort of came through in the writing, that there is open-endedness, and there's a need to sort of think about how these dynamics are reconfigured, and how platforms are sort of active actors, like in an SCS sense as well. That they are actors, technologies are actors, and how they're sort of influencing this. And I think I want to develop that a little bit more. Again, I don't have a ready answer, but I think that's the idea. But yeah, I think I'm really grateful for a lot of those comments, and I'd love to chat more.
Thanks for having taken us through.
All right. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. Really including any online. In the room, we've got one. I've queued them up. Two. I've got one. So that's three. They'll probably go through. So to go first.
I was just wondering if during your research you came across Robin Hood Army.
I did. Yeah.
I
did. Well, so there were actually a lot of volunteers who I spoke to who were part of the Robin Hood Army, and they did come to a lot of mutual aid work around food, or just generally thinking about the politics of food as well from that particular lens. And so I haven't given it a lot of thought. I would say I've given it some thought, but I haven't also given it a lot of thought, because it's again one of the things, like that's at least what I've focused on. One of the many things in the constellation of like volunteer efforts that already sustain the city. So I remember the first time I came across Robin Hood Army, I was very curious about the caste politics underlying that. And I think that question still stands for me, academically speaking. But that said, I one cannot deny that they are doing important work in the cities. And I think that holds true for a lot of the efforts that we're talking about, because I think that's the uncomfortable, discomfort around some of these things for me as well, because there are political dimensions that, as researchers, as academics, we come to with a very different lens, but there is the ground reality of how a lot of these efforts function and what value they add. So yeah, I think that I'm still sort of grappling with that, but that's cool.
I'd love to talk more about it sometime. That was my PhD research project. I haven't heard on you. So I'd love to talk.
Yeah, we should.
Oh, I have one more. Is it okay to ask one more?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought you mentioned briefly something about like the work flexibility. Did you have a lot of people volunteering? Like, how were they able to have the time? Did they tell you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think most of them sort of touched upon it. The first group of people, I think they're homemakers, so they don't have the time, but they make time for some of these things. And I actually thought it was fairly interesting to think about how they were sort of justifying their availability of time, and that's kind of what led me to the flexibility question as well, because they're like, oh, we don't go to work, so we have more time to do this, whereas they then subsequently went on to list all the different things that they do in the home, and it's like, where do you have the time for this? But yeah, so that's
4.5 hours sleep.
yes, yes, that's kind of it. And that, in fact, that's kind of true for like everyone. I think I included one of those pictures where this volunteer had sort of tracked on his smartwatch the number of hours he slept in there in these months, which was consistently like 1 hour, 2 hours sleep. And this guy worked in a bank. He had a full-time day job, and then he sort of did this. I don't know when, but he did it. So, and a lot, the genuinely harrowing reality for a lot of the volunteers was that they were balancing a lot of things, and that also included care work responsibilities within the homes that they were already sort of dealing with. The WhatsApp group that I was talking about, that was actually started by someone who lost someone. In fact, the other group, the No Code app as well, she was also dealing with her parents being sick and in the hospital. And so there were also all of those kinds of commitments that they were balancing this with. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at, the flexibility, but I abandoned that as an idea because it didn't seem to capture the intensity of what was happening. Did I answer?
Yeah, that's good.
Awesome.
Try to be quick. Congratulations on looking into a fascinating topic. You've got a lot to work with and work towards. I'm interested in the sort of spatial aspect of these networks of volunteers. And did you find that they were sort of geographically self-organizing, or what role did the platforms play in constituting the geographies of these networks? And how did that intersect with the state-based lockdown regulations and that sort of stuff?
I think that's also a great question. Thanks for asking, because I didn't get a chance to touch upon this in the presentation also, because I think that was a very key dimension for a lot of these collectives, and that also brings out the networked aspect of this really sharply, because there were some volunteers who were doing on-ground work, for instance, so they had run into the state. And so subsequently they would send those updates on the group. But there were some people who were just coordinating while sitting in an office, right? So they were just making calls and things like that. So I think that's one sort of dimension in which the geography and the geographical element of the dimension of the city, how it's organized, and who can access what kinds of spaces. And this is very strictly speaking from a cultural geography, critic geography kind of perspective. But that sort of comes out in this sense. But there are also longer trajectories of migration from the city, which has global networks, which sort of creates these global networks. So a lot of people, for instance, had friends in the US or in the UK who had parents, elderly relatives who were in the city. And so that's sort of how they joined a lot of these groups. So in that sense, there's also like some amount of reach that these networks have. But other than that, I think I'm not sure if I've thought of the geography of a lot of these networks beyond that, in the sense that there's also, like, I think what I've tried to sort of underscore in this is that there are these place-based kinds of knowledges that are very, very critical to these networks, like for the effectiveness of these networks. Because there are specific people, like there are people who've been in the city for like years, so they know pretty much everything about where you get what kind of thing. They have long-term connections with the city, and that sort of really came in handy when like people needed help. And in sort of creating those resources and having those personal relationships with service providers and things like that. So just having that kind of I think that's what the geographical element also sort of is oriented towards, to say that those knowledges were geographically sort of configured in some ways. Like, I'm not sure if that's a super clear answer, but it is something that's
We've got time. I'm going to ask my question. Anushree, thank you so much for that great presentation. I'm going to ask you a question that I think I asked you last year when I first heard your presentation. Quick talk. You know this. Your presentation, grounds us in this sense, like, there are these I guess these different kind of ideologies, might say, or at work here. And I guess the one that's about the entrepreneurial, like, points us to, I think, that it's this question of the future. What are the afterlives of these collectives? And now, as Dave was saying, we're in I think you said late post-Fortis moment. We're in a late post-COVID moment. Have some of these collectives been institutionalized or turned into other kinds of initiatives or careers for some of the participants? Like, what has been kind of some of the afterlives of something like this?
Talk about this in presentation. Bringing it up, and yes, this is not the dreaded question.
Okay, cool.
I think I have an answer. So I think a lot of, and in fact, after we met at the STHV school last year, I think I gave this a lot of thought, and this came up repeatedly in a lot of conversations. So to some extent, I think it comes out in the society and space paper, the paper that focuses on labor, because I think that's what the idea of like hope labor kind of sort of is geared towards, because that uncomfortable kind of like tension between, or whether this is volunteering work or whether you're actually trying to like make a career out of this, are you trying to make this like a profit motivated thing. I think that tension sort of is sort of, I guess, made less tense if I think about it in terms of hope, because that becomes like an analytical way to think about how the economy itself also operates, because again, a lot of these people are young people, so they're also trying to make it. They're also in that like sort of age group and demographic where they're just either passed out of educational institutions, and they're sort of thinking about what kind of career trajectories to make. They're also looking at hustling opportunities and things like that. So it sits in that blurry space of whether this is work, non-work, whether this is something we're just doing to like live in the city, have a life in the city. And in that sense, I think the afterlives of a lot of these efforts, the most persistent answer that I've gotten from most of the volunteers that I've spoken to is that they found community, that they made friends, and they have people that they can talk to if they're in a bad spot after having participated in these networks, and that they know people who think like them, like who care about the same things that they do, and want to do something about it. So I think that kind of sense of community is something that a lot of people told me was their takeaway from these spaces. The collective spaces in themselves, I think each of them have had a different kind of trajectory. So the Trice WhatsApp sort of space, that becomes like a marketplace kind of space, because the group that they started, the smallish WhatsApp group of home chefs who were doing this and thought they could, do this on the side while being homemakers. They made a slightly more sophisticated WhatsApp group, and they also all have storefronts on Trice now. So the app itself sort of offers that kind of marketplace space for them to have a career in whatever, like as an entrepreneur, as a home-based entrepreneur. And there is again a lot of diversification in terms of what home-based entrepreneurs can also do, what home chefs specifically do. There is a whole economy around that, which is again one of the tangents that I was really, really swept up by at one point, but resisted very much to not pursue fully. But that's definitely happened. And the second space exists as such. So there were a few other public health scares. I think something around black fungus and a few more viruses that I'm now forgetting, which in the 2023 mild COVID, post-COVID, whatever period, and I'm using air quotes very deliberately because we were not post-COVID in 2023. There were still active cases, and there was still need for conversation. But in that spirit, also that space exists, and it was, I remember, because I was part of the group at that point, and I remember it being one of those spaces where you could talk about these things when people didn't want to talk about any of it. And when news media, when mainstream sort of media doesn't want to address these as public health concerns, spaces like these become really, really important to just get any kind of information. And so in that sense, that particular group was really helpful. It's still active. There are still a lot of blood donation requests, other kinds of medical support requests, information requests sort of that are circulated there. And I found it really valuable sort of, just have that space. The last space is more career oriented, and most of the volunteers just, one of them is an influencer. Others do their own thing. So that's more career.
I'm going to choose to emphasize the trajectory of hope as the closing comment. And on that note, I'd like everybody to please thank me. Join me. Don't thank me. Join me. And